Salam sejahtera, selamat petang. Very good afternoon to most of you. Good morning to some of you. I hope everyone is doing well. Now we have about 76 participants in this group, so let's make a start. Let me introduce myself. My name is Soon from EcoIdeal Consulting. I will be your moderator for this afternoon. Myself, I'm currently the CEO of EcoIdeal Consulting, which is a consultant specializing in carbon management, renewable energy, and waste management. I myself is a trained environmental engineer, and I'm very happy to have so many of you joining us today. Let me introduce you a little bit to this webinar. This low carbon cities webinar series, this is one of them, the second one actually. Today we are going to focus on the GHG inventory or the carbon reporting for cities, for city level. And I'm very happy to inform you that we have the privilege of having some very esteemed speakers. I will be introducing them to you very soon. So as part of this series of a webinar, it's actually organized by the Green Technology Application for Development of Low Carbon Cities program, which is supported by the United Nations Development Program, Malaysia, and the Ministry of Environment and Water, Malaysia, Qatar, and implemented by SEDA, Sustainable Energy Development Authority. The GTALCC program is designed to accelerate a low carbon city adoption in Malaysia, and it has been running already for several years. And this series of webinars is to highlight some of the key issues required for low carbon cities, where we will explore a bit more on the subject of this GHG inventory for cities. And our focus today will be on benchmarking. You might ask, why benchmarking? So I just want to share a little bit why this topic is because, over my 20 years of working experience, in many cases, both government, also private, like corporate sectors, they will always ask, how am I doing compared to our peers? Are we doing okay? How are we comparing with our competitors, for example? So I think benchmarking is an interesting subject, and I hope our experts, our panelists will be able to elaborate a little bit and maybe discuss a little bit. And I think it would be even better if we can have a good debate or discussion on it. Let me introduce you to our first speaker, Mr. Michael Dawes. He's currently in the UK, I believe. And let me just give you a little bit of background who he is. Well, Michael is a leading international inventory and climate expert with 15 years of experience in supporting cities around the world, including Southeast Asia. I understand that he has done some very good work here, also in Malaysia, training some of our local authorities in doing accounting of carbon. And he is the lead author of the Global Protocol for Community-Scale Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventory, in short GPC standard, and also the PAS 2070 specifications for the assessment of greenhouse gas emission for a city. Michael was the Director of Measurement and Planning at the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. C40 is comprising, I think, approximately 100 cities throughout the world, some of the big cities. In Malaysia, I believe Kuala Lumpur is one of the members. And he just ended this attachment to C40 in May this year, so it's very recent. And during his time in C40, he's responsible for the Global Climate Action Planning Program. And before C40, Michael is very active in UK, serving the Mayor of London on different issues related to the environment. Okay, Michael, please.
Great, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you my experience over the last 15 years. As mentioned, up until last month, I was the Director of Measurement and Planning at C40 Cities, a network of over 100 cities around the world, including KL as one of C40 cities. So I'll share that experience with you and some insights into the inventory process, but also the benefits of benchmarking. So I'll just show you the content that I like to go through. Just a quick, as I'm the first speaker, a quick recap of what an inventory is and why we measure emissions at the city level. Then a quick recap of the GPC, which is the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions, which is currently the most popular global standard for city greenhouse gas reporting. So I'll give some background on that. And then finally, towards the end, using some graphs to highlight the benefits and impact of benchmarking and how it can provide value to you as a city, but also as a ministry or other partner supporting cities in their journey on climate change. So this is an inventory, and it's an account of greenhouse gas emissions, similar to a financial account. It shows you the greenhouse gases emitted, but also absorbed from the atmosphere, and lists them by source. In this case, by sector, by subsector, and by what we call scope, which defines where the emissions occur. But it's simply a record of emissions from a city were reported in a consistent and a structured way. Again, this is a summary picture. You can see the sectors on the left and then the scopes on the right and the graph to show that as well. So it's an account. It tells you the quantity of emissions emitted by a city in a particular year and defines the boundary to make sure it's very clear what is being recorded and what is not being recorded. Now, why measure emissions at the city level? Ultimately, because that's where planning for climate action begins. It gives you an understanding of what's contributing to the emissions, which sectors are contributing the most to your emissions. It allows you to establish a baseline and to forecast future emissions. That in turn allows you to set a greenhouse gas reduction target. And all of that really helps you produce an evidence base to support the development, implementation, and tracking of policies in action on climate change. Again, very relevant to today's webinar. It also helps you to compare, learn from, and share best practices with other cities. It gives greater confidence to decision makers and investors that your city knows what they're doing and is indeed on the right track. So a very big thing about this is confidence and transparency and accountability. It can enhance your reputation if you have good accounting processes in your city, and that can be used to attract investment, to engage with different stakeholders because they know you're very competent and have a good reputation in this field. It can be used to improve communication with cities, within cities, with your residents, with your businesses, to really explain, well, most of our emissions are coming from this sector, therefore we're prioritizing actions within this sector. So it's all very important around communication, showing progress rather than just saying we've made progress, really to highlight the size and the makeup of your emissions. And ultimately, to achieve compliance with various initiatives and organizations, a lot of reporting platforms and global initiatives do require you to measure your emissions in a consistent way. So it also helps you to be part of those networks and to meet their compliance requirements. The next slide just quickly shows the cycle, and starting in the top right is where you develop your emissions inventory. That's used to establish a baseline and forecast, used to decide on your reduction targets. You then adopt an action plan based upon the insight you've gained from your emissions and your targets, implement actions, monitor progress, update your inventory, and the cycle repeats itself. So inventories are very much part of the climate action planning cycle, and very much form the bedrock to both inform your actions, but also to track and monitor your progress. So to support cities to do this in a consistent way, the GPC was developed and launched in 2014 by WRI, C40 and ICLEI, with a host of international organizations supporting that process. And it's an accounting and reporting standard for cities, specifically for cities, because city reporting is different to corporate reporting and therefore requires its own standard. And it's robust, it's been tested, it's transparent, it's consistent, and it's globally accepted. So it has all of the qualities you're looking for an international standard. A key thing to note is that the GPC sets out requirements. It doesn't specify a methodology. It therefore gives flexibility to cities to choose their own methodologies as long as they meet the boundary definitions of the GPC. And this slide kind of shows what the world was like before a global standard and after. And before, you have different types of measurements, difficult to compare, difficult to benchmark. It was difficult to be sure whether cities recorded all their emissions or just part of their emissions. And it was also difficult to relate city action to national action. And that's been addressed through the design of the GPC. This is what the GPC measures. And again, it defines a minimum criteria and defines a very clear boundary to ensure consistent measurement so that if City A is reporting emissions, City B is doing it in a very similar way. And that means you need to define your boundary, your city, your geographic boundary, your time span, the same 12-month period, but also define some contextual information which can be used for benchmarking, like population and GDP. Then emission sources, there are mandatory sectors and optional sectors. Same with greenhouse gases, there are mandatory gases and optional gases. And the mandatory components are the easier ones to collect and often the more important ones as well. And the optional ones are a more advanced level. The emissions tend to be smaller, but also the data is more difficult to collect. So mostly we look at the mandatory components as defining a GPC boundary. And the bottom then tells you the kind of data you need around activity data, emission factors, data sources, as well as a data quality assessment. And these are the sectors that come under the GPC. So a very comprehensive look at a city, looking at buildings, transportation, waste, industry, but also agriculture and forestry. And the latter two are the optional components of the GPC. And also you have this thing called scopes, which sets out where the emissions arise. And this is really important for consistency, because you can only really benchmark if you're comparing like against like. And therefore the GPC, what the GPC does really well is it makes sure that all cities report a consistent and similar boundary for their emissions. And that's very much defined by these scopes. I won't go into detail, but if you're not familiar with the concept of scopes, I would encourage you to have a look at the GPC chapter on scopes to make sure you are familiar with that concept. Okay, so moving on to the benefits of benchmarking, and I'm going to take you through a series of graphs to illustrate the actual benefits. So the first one here we have, this is the 40 cities. A global standard allows for comparison and benchmarking and indeed aggregation around the world. And here we're seeing emissions inventories from all cities around the world, and we see the makeup of their emissions by sector. Blue is stationary, buildings, red is transportation, and green is waste. You begin to see some similar patterns in different regions, which again can be used for benchmarking and comparison purposes. Here we see the emissions, in this case, these are emissions of Boston over time, and a consistent standard allows benchmarking over time. And this is benchmarking yourself against your historical emissions and tracking progress over time. In this case, we can see emissions from Boston with the bar charts, GDP going up, the blue dotted line, and population going up in the green dotted line. So as their emissions have gone down, their population and GDP have continued to increase between 2005 and 2015. And same here for Portland. Again, they're benchmarking their own performance, and you can see their emissions dropping from 2006 to 2019, and quite a drastic drop here. Again, this is really valuable to communicate to your citizens and your businesses, but also your peers, to show the progress you'll be making overall, but also broken down by sector. And this is an example from Melbourne, where you can see they've used their 2010 emissions to do a forecast and to look at their emissions after abatement action. So again, using the inventory to set targets and to track progress. Inventories and the consistency also allow us to understand where emissions come from. In this case, these are aggregated inventories across all C40 cities, and they really allow us to identify what are the big drivers of emissions. In this case, it's mostly buildings, 63%, then transportation, 28%, and then waste, 9%. But this gives more detail. It breaks it down by subsector, by scope. So it really gives you an insight into the drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. It allows us to explore differences and similarities. And in this graph, we can see the percentage makeup for each city, and each dot is a city of their inventory. So If it says 10%, it's 10% of their inventory is comprised of buildings in the bottom right. What we can see here is, for example, and we have global north v global south. If we look at waste, we can see that for some cities in the global south, waste emissions comprise up to 45% of their emissions inventory. For the global north, that is the maximum 25%, so a huge difference there. So a key lesson here is when you're benchmarking, compare like with like. Don't compare yourself to cities that are very different to you, but find cities that are similar to you in composition, in size, in makeup in terms of industry. So you're able to compare yourself against similar cities rather than cities in a very different context. So this looks at global north, global south emissions based upon the percentage of each sector towards the total emissions. And this next chart shows the primary fuel, the original fuel type generating emissions. And again, this is a simple global north, global south comparison. But one thing we can see very quickly is that in the global south, most fuels come from primary fuels, from primary fossil fuels, from gasoline, from diesel, whereas in the global north, they mostly come from grid supplied energy. So again, useful insight you can gain by comparing inventories and by benchmarking yourself against other cities and other regions. We can also then dive a bit deeper and actually look at what's driving emissions and look at some of the things sort of actually generating emissions. In this case, we've got a chart comparing building energy consumption against grid carbon intensity, and each bubble is a city. Blue are global north cities and orange are global south cities, and we can see that building energy consumption in global south is very low. For the global north, it's much higher, with a big diversity, big range, both in terms of consumption and grid carbon, and the size of the emissions indicate the size of the overall emissions, and this can help you to target which cities you would want to support mostly because they're contributing most to emissions. So the one in the top right, the white quadrant, is where most emissions arise, and the bottom left are where the fewest emissions arise. So this allows you then to target support to particular cities or particular interventions by being able to compare cities against each other. Similarly, we can look at transportation, and this graph compares, again, global south on the left, global north on the right. It looks at how compact and connected cities can result in lower emissions than larger disaggregated cities, spread out cities. And you can see as we go from the top to the bottom, the emissions tend to increase, particularly in the global north. And that shows that where you have compact cities with higher population densities, you tend to have lower emissions from land transportation. And then my final slide, again, is also something that comes out of the GPC. You're asked to indicate the data quality for all your data sources. And again, this is important for transparency, to understand, to give people confidence in how good your data is, and also for you to identify how you can improve your data over time. If we then aggregate those across all cities and compare them against each other, we can find out where the best data lies and where the data with the highest uncertainties lies. In this case, the darker the purple, the greater the confidence in the data, the higher the quality. And we can see on the left activity data, on the right emission factors. We can see the data is best for buildings. And as we go down this table, the data reduces in quality. So we know the biggest uncertainties are in transportation and in waste. And again, that would then be a priority area for improving data collection in the future. But you can do this within a country, compare the data quality and use that to identify areas for improvement to make sure your next inventory is better than the last one. And the one after that will be a bit better than the one that came before that. So just to recap, and again, I know this has been a sort of a whistle-stop tour, but you'll have the slides to access, and we'll have time to discuss this in more detail during the Q&A. But again, the key benefits are it supports monitoring of performance over time and target setting, helps us see where emissions come from, and it allows you to look at differences and similarities between cities. It yields insight into the drivers of emissions, and you can identify areas of uncertainty and where to prioritize further improvements. And with that, I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Michael, for the insightful presentation. Okay, so we do have one question for Michael, but I will take it a bit later on, okay? So I think that's a very good start with some introduction of the standard used for city level reporting, and also a bit of a briefing on what kind of benchmarking can be done and experience from the past. That's very, very good. Next up, we have Hannah from CDP, which is formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. Let me introduce Hannah. Hannah is currently the Asia Pacific lead for city, states, regions at CDP. CDP is an international NGO that focuses on city, regions, investors, and companies on taking urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy by measuring and understanding their environmental impact. CDP currently is one of the most popular, I would say, one of the popular programs that both corporate as well as cities are reporting to, and they are in a way been benchmarked using the program. And I understand there's also some rating system used under the CDP, so I'll let Hannah read through that. She joined CDP in 2014 and focused on the CDP's city program in Asia Pacific, and later expanding it to state and region. In this role, Hannah works with stakeholders to accelerate the ambitious climate and environmental action. Before CDP, Hannah worked in both private and non-profit sectors for 8 years. And she has worked in some interesting NGOs, software as service company, in issues related to sustainability and social responsibility. Hannah has a bachelor degree in international relations from Tufts University in USA, and she's currently based in Hong Kong. Hannah, would you like to take over?
Great, thank you so much for that. Let me just start sharing my slides. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So thank you again for having me today. It's a real pleasure. It seems like a lifetime ago now, but in 2019, I spent quite a bit of time in Malaysia, working directly with cities. So it's a shame not to be there in person, but at least we have technology to do this virtually. So I hope everyone's keeping safe and healthy, and we're all doing well. So today I will kind of take a step back from the more technical aspects around the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And to start, I just wanted to introduce CDP in a bit more detail, because I think there's probably a number of people who don't know CDP very well, although I do see some familiar names, which is great. But ultimately, CDP is a not-for-profit organization. We started in the UK back in 2000. And we've been around for over 20 years now, and we have offices around the world. So as mentioned, I'm based in our Hong Kong office. And our vision is really to see a thriving economy that works for people and planet in the long term. So this is, I think, quite important to remember, because we're talking about moving towards a sustainable economy. So this isn't just about protecting the planet, which is crucial as well as the people that live in it. But we want to make sure that the kind of global economy is working in a sustainable way and shifting towards that. So how we do this is by focusing cities and states, as well as investors and companies, on taking urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy. And we provide a global disclosure platform or reporting platform through which over 10,000 organizations disclosed in 2020. And this is across a number of different thematic areas, which include climate change, as well as deforestation and water security. So looking at kind of a wider scope of environmental areas, but these are all also interconnected. So we know that, for example, forests provide a huge kind of sink for carbon, as well as that water security is threatened due to impacts of climate change, for example. So in Asia Pacific, which is the region that I'm responsible for, in 2020 we saw over 130 cities as well as state and regional governments disclose, including a number of them based in Malaysia, some of which reported for the first time, which was fantastic to see. So we hope that this will continue to increase. And I think looking over kind of the trends over the last 10 years of disclosure, we're definitely seeing this this go up. And why do cities actually disclose a report through CDP? So there are a number of different reasons, and I would say that it's not kind of blanket reasons that apply to all cities, but some main ones are around local and regional networks, such as C40, as well as ICLE, which many of you may know. And then there are initiatives such as the Global Covenant of Mayors, the WWF's One Planet City Challenge. This year as well, a big one is the Cities Race to Zero and the lead up to COP. So to be part of these different networks and initiatives, there is an element of reporting, for some of these particularly focused on making sure as a foundation that there is a greenhouse gas emissions inventory in place. So that's one of the key reasons. Also, I think we've received a lot of feedback that cities gain a lot of kind of best practice and knowledge exchange through this process. And that enables them to access insights, and there's additional tools and services that CDP provides, one of which I'll mention in a bit more detail later, which is around scoring, and that's particularly related to the benchmarking topic that we're talking about today. And I think one of the kind of unique positions of CDP is that we do work across sectors. So engaging with the private sector is an area that we're kind of building on more and more. So we've developed different initiatives, such as the City Business Climate Alliance, which we piloted in London a few years ago, whereby we brought together the Mayor of London's office together with some key businesses within the city to work towards setting some ambitious targets to reduce emissions in some key sectors, such as waste or transport and so on. And then finally, CDP's kind of, really the foundation of everything we do is around transparency and accountability. So, particularly around the issue of climate change, without transparency, without being able to measure, the sources of emissions through inventories, for example, without setting targets and actually having this kind of, information publicly available, it's almost impossible for the global community to keep track of whether we're actually going to be able to address climate change. So that's one of the, kind of very key reasons as well why local governments are, wanting to disclose through CDP. And of course, this data doesn't just sit with CDP, but it actually has a huge impact. So it goes out to, for example, the policy community, such as the UNFCCC. Some of you may know their Global Climate Action Portal, which actually displays climate action that's being taken across all sectors, as well as civil society, such as the partners I mentioned earlier, and then academics, business and finance community. And so the data actually helps to inform a lot of other initiatives, research, policy making, and so on. And then here I just wanted to kind of take a step back, because when you talk about inventories, you can kind of get really stuck in the the details. But why is it that it's so important for cities to take climate action in the first place? And I think these are statistics that many of us know, but we know that more than half of the world's population already live in cities, and this is going to only increase. We also know that around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from cities. So what this kind of translates to is that there's a huge potential for cities then to also reduce emissions and ensure that we're on track to a kind of low emissions world. And that's not to say that cities are not already taking action. So actually, cities are already places where they're working towards vibrant, livable, sustainable places for people to live and work, and tackling some really complex and interconnected issues, such as we've seen over the last couple of years now, health and well-being, as well as things like equity and social cohesion, and so on. So cities are already doing the hard work, and we should definitely acknowledge that. So just a few weeks ago, we released a kind of big piece of analysis that looked at the last 10 years of cities' disclosure. So 2011 was actually the first year when cities started going through this reporting process, and also looking ahead to the next decade. And we've seen huge progress. So not only has the number of cities disclosing gone up, but there's also many more cities that actually have greenhouse gas emissions inventories in place. So it's almost 70% now, which tells us a lot actually, because that is kind of the foundation for the cities to then go on to setting their emissions reduction targets, to then have an action plan in place as well as to how they're going to reduce those emissions. And of course, the kind of goalpost we're looking towards is this, pathway towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, again, when we talk about inventories, it's important to think about, what is the reason for actually doing these inventories in the first place, and what it enables and empowers cities to be able to do, which is to set those targets and work towards them. And here, I won't go through this in too much detail, but again, we just want to make sure that cities are looking ahead to this next critical decade, one of which, one of the actions is, setting a science-based target, which is, making sure that you have an inventory so that you know where your emission sources are coming from. That enables you to set a target and also understand, where you need to reduce those emissions and take the appropriate actions needed. So you're not kind of flying blind, I guess. And then there's some other actions here as well. Yeah, and then I just wanted to quickly touch upon the benchmarking process that CDP uses, which is scoring. We see that kind of climate action and reporting is a journey. So we've developed a scoring process through which cities can progress through from disclosure all the way up to leadership. And this is actually similar to what is being applied to companies. So we've seen that this over, more than 10 years on the company side has really helped to increase ambition and accelerate action. And in just the last few years, we've seen the same for cities as well. So in 2020, we had 88 cities on the A list, one of which was Adelaide, who I'm very happy to see is presenting here today as well. So really looking forward to them sharing their experience. And that's it. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hannah, for the presentation. Yeah, I like the fact that you said from reporting to action. I think that's what it matters actually. I think the inventory itself is only a starting point for a city to go towards low carbon city. And what is really important, I think, is knowing your emissions and then trying to set strategy actions to reduce them, probably against a target. Well, okay, so if you have any questions to Hannah, would you please put in the Q&A box, please. Next slide, please. Okay, now we have our final two speakers, and they are presenting together. And I have the privilege to now introduce them. And they are coming from Australia, the city of Adelaide. As already mentioned by Hannah, is one of the A-list reporting city who has been doing well. So I look forward for them to share their real hands-on experience in this matter. Okay, let me start with William. William is the principal climate change advisor at City of Adelaide, and he's responsible for the delivery of the City of Adelaide's carbon neutral certification, the community greenhouse gas emission planning, and climate risk agenda. He also supports the city low carbon transition and a focus on best practice in GHG emission measurement and reporting. William, before he ended up in Australia at the moment, he was working in New Zealand, and he has supported various organizations in sustainability and climate change program. He has more than 10 years of experience in sustainability, climate change, and environment, and he has worked both in government and private sectors. He has a master's degree in corporate environmental management from Finland and a Bachelor of Arts from USA. His colleague, Ms. Chua Mingin, is a climate change coordinator of low carbon and circular economy team in the city of Adelaide. She's responsible for supporting the delivery of the strategic climate change projects. And Mingin has a degree from RMIT University from Melbourne, Australia, with a bachelor degree in environmental engineering. And she has been involved in carbon accounting and waste management in her career. So can I have William and Mingin to take over and give us a sharing of your experience, please?
Yep. Hello, everyone. So my name is Mingin, and I'm here today with my colleague William Van Astel, representing the City of Adelaide to share our GHG inventories and benchmarking experience as a city. So in this presentation, we'll be covering our latest community greenhouse gas emission inventory, how we calculate the difficult to quantify sectors such as aviation, the complexity of benchmarking population, and also the intersection with science-based target. So I'll start the presentation with a bit of background to our city. So Adelaide City is the capital city of the state of South Australia, and it has a total area of 16 kilometers square. It is definitely on the smaller side of the scale comparing to other cities in Australia, such as City of Melbourne, which has an area of about 40 kilometers square, and Brisbane City, which is over 1,000 kilometers square. However, we are very proud of our city, which is surrounded by a ring of parks, which we call the Adelaide Parklands. As you can see on the picture on the right-hand side, the green line is our city boundary, and we have a ring of parklands, which is in the green shade as well. So these parklands consist of 7.6 kilometers square of our total area, and they are like the backyard to our city. And also Adelaide City is the CBD of South Australia, and we contribute an approximate 20% of the South Australia economy in the last financial year. So just like any other city who reports their emissions using GPC standard, we are also accounting for our scope 1, 2, and 3, which you can see on the left-hand side here. So in scope 1, which is all the emissions that happen inside our boundary, we are accounting for the stationary energy, the transportation, the waste, and the product use. And scope 2 is the grid supply energy, which is our electricity consumption. Scope 3, our out-of-boundary emissions, which we account the T&D losses from electricity, transportation, waste, other indirect emissions, such as upstream emissions from fuel generation. So let's get into the numbers. So we started our own in-house greenhouse gas emission inventory since 2007, which also then become our base year. So we collect annualized data, but only complete our inventory every other year. For example, we collect data together in 2019 and 2020, but only complete the inventory in 2020. So as you can see in this table, we have 21% reduction between our current data and our base year in 2007, and also a 4.5% reduction between 2019 and 2020. So I know it's kind of hard to digest this number immediately and try to see the proportion or percentage in your head. So I'm going to give you a quick sneak peek into our dashboard, which is the community greenhouse gas emission dashboard that we will be publishing on our website very soon, but not yet. So you guys will be sort of the first people outside our organization to see this dashboard. Just a second. So on this dashboard, you can see on the right-hand side, it is showing the greenhouse gas emission in financial year. And this is 2020 because nothing else has been clicked. So this dashboard is actually interactive, and it's basically the same exact thing that I showed on the PowerPoint in the table. So everything is interactive and everything is straightforward. For example, if I click on the solid waste, it shows that the solid waste is 83,000 tons in 2020, and it stands 9% of the total year emission for 2020. And also down here, you can see the percentage changes between financial year. So solid waste increased 8% from the previous years and increased 47% from our base year, 2007. And you can also see like everything is clickable. Even for the whole year, you can click them. And to make life easier for some people, we have the sector base as well. So on a higher level, so it will, so if you click energy, it will show commercial building, industrial, residential, and transport is the same. Yep. So besides this is the overall for the whole year. And then we can see from our base year until our current emissions. So it's very easy for you to compare, and you don't have to do all the calculation, how many percent changes in your Excel. You just click and then it will show you. So there's another page, which drill down from that page, which showing just 2020, the year 2020. And then I've listed all the emission sources that we've accounted in here. And then it's very easy for you to just scan through and know which one is your largest emission source. So for example, electricity, if you click on it, it will show you 29%. So electricity is 29% of our total 2020 emissions. And also we often get people coming to us asking, so how do you calculate your emissions? Where do you get the data from? That's why we put in this section as well. How is the emission calculated? So electricity, we use the total electricity consumption in the city boundary, which we obtain from our SA power network. So all of them, they have just one sentence, which is very straight to the point. How do we get this data from and how do we calculate them? And it also has the same high level sector button, which you can use. So, yep, basically that's the live demo from me. And I will then pass my presentation to William, which will talk about the sector-based data collection and also per capita benchmarking.
So thank you, Ming. And thank you, Malaysia, for letting us have Ming for a little bit, which he's done great work. So as Ming has shown, our emissions are falling relatively quickly, and this is due to electricity, which has a significant impact on our carbon footprint and will continue to contribute to emissions reduction. So over half of our electricity is generated by solar and wind, and the state is pursuing 100% renewable generation goal in the next 9 years. So the resulting reductions will be aided by things like on-site batteries and high penetration of solar on households and businesses. And this projection shows to 2050, essentially, that we're going to be at 100% renewable electricity, and it's going to have a very large impact on our emissions. Next slide. So like most cities, and as was mentioned, we follow the GPC, and we thought we'd just dive into the aviation, which is our newest emission source. And for Basic Plus, it's a requirement. And so speaking about benchmarking, I virtually traveled the world to try and find other cities who calculated emissions, and in Australia, there aren't any. So there was no one else to benchmark this information from. So as was alluded to earlier, GPC provides a framework, but to actually develop the calculations and assumptions, it's on the city to do that. So we developed what I think is a unique way of calculating aviation. And so according to GPC, we have to allocate a certain proportion of emissions from the region's airport that serves the city. And so essentially we came up with a new approach where we found the right survey, luckily, from the Tourism Research Australia, which showed residential, worker travel, and visitor travel to each part of Australia from Adelaide. And through that, we were able to calculate the annual emissions of aviation. So we just thought that might be a useful piece of information for other cities trying to think about that emission source. Next slide. So getting into the final slide, per capita benchmarking. This is dynamic. As Ming mentioned, we're a business center, so we don't have very many people who actually live here. So a lot of science-based target setting and benchmarking is based on per capita emissions. And if we use that method, we would have a similar per capita emissions to places like Dubai, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. But we don't drive a lot of Bugattis here, and we're not an oil-based city, so it's essentially incorrect for us to benchmark per capita. So again, we developed a new model to benchmark, and that's based on city use. So again, we broke down population, visitors, and workers, and it essentially created a normalized population for the city of Adelaide, which essentially triples our population per capita and then lowers our per capita emissions to 13.5 tons, which is similar to the Australian average, much higher than the 5 tons world global average. But this allowed us to set the appropriate or start thinking about the appropriate science-based targets, which in our case will have to decrease 70 to 75% in the next 9 years and net zero by 2050. So as we project into the future, things like working from home, residents in the city, all of these different changes in the city are going to change the per capita metrics that we've developed. So this was just an example to show that per capita benchmarking is dynamic and all cities have their own profile. So you really have to understand your city before you start developing benchmarking that means anything. So with that, we'll conclude and just with stating that benchmarking requires analytical but also creative approaches to coming up with new models to quantify all the unique attributes of different cities. And you'll see Ming there with the Malaysian flag at the end.
That's a nice photo at the end. Okay, thank you, William and Ming.
Thank you.
I would like to move us to the next part of the program, and we have received a few questions. Maybe let's start with that, and yeah, let me have a look. Okay, we do have one question regarding GPC, and the question from Dr. Tan Siting is, can it be applied to a smaller scale such as a township? What are the limitations if a township wants to use GPC as the benchmarking standard? I guess perhaps I could ask Michael to answer this since he's an expert in the standard. Is Michael around? Yeah?
Yes. No, thank you. So the way the GPC is designed is that it applies to any geography, whether it's a small township or a large capital city. The key thing is you've got to very clearly define your boundary. So define the geographical boundary. The challenge you'll be having though is getting good data, and data often isn't available the smaller you go in terms of size of town or city. So you may need to make some more approximations, some more assumptions, scale data down from regional level or use proxy data. That's the biggest challenge you'll have. The smaller you make the size of your area, the more difficult it will be to collect good quality data. So, but in principle, the GPC has been designed to apply to any geography.
Yeah, fantastic. That will be also my answer to the question if I'm to answer it. So yeah, so no issue. Okay, next question is about from Mr. Robert Cheung. he asks, what is this report for? Who is it for, and whether a third-party verification is required to increase the credibility of the reporting. So perhaps I will pose this question to William and Mingin, because I think you are the one who has been disclosing, and it's so exciting to see you are going to disclose to the public also. So maybe you can answer this. Why did you, go into this reporting, and who is it for? And did you thought about having a third party to come in and audit your data?
So there's no third-party verification that I know of for community inventories, but we do report through CDP, which then feeds into the Global Covenant of Mayors and other reporting mechanisms. So we report through third parties, but we don't have it verified. It's a question I've asked myself before, but that just doesn't exist.
Okay. How about maybe Hannah? Do you have any feedback to that one? Is there any cities that you know that has done a third-party verification on their reporting?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do ask in the reporting process if cities have had their inventories verified by third party, but it is still a pretty low number that have done so. And I think it does depend a bit on, kind of what like verifiers are available, in that particular country. But there are, consultancies that do this type of verification, and there are consultancies that helped with the compilation of the inventory in the first place who, provide kind of those additional services as well. So it's not something that's, super common among cities yet. We know that it's much more common among companies, for example, but there is a small number that do verification.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. Micah, do you have any thoughts about this?
I think, the key thing for me is I think it's consistency in whatever you do. And I think the great thing about the GPC, about the Global Covenant, about CDP is they're all aligned organizations. They're all working from the same sort of, essentially the same starting point with the same principles. And that's really, for me, what's the most important thing is it's as long as what you're measuring is consistent and transparent, then the best thing is to get started, get your inventory out there, start to benchmark, start to track your progress. But yeah, the key thing is that whatever we're doing is we're basing upon the essentially same principles, and that's very much the hard work behind the scenes has been done to make sure that's happened.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I think in conclusion, it's probably not very commonly done in terms of getting third party to kind of verify the report. But I do know, like in corporate standards, this is probably more common done for transparency and accountability reason. So it's still a very new area, I guess, to answer Robert's question. All right, we have another question. Says here that the transport and electricity emissions are the main contributor. I think this is also the case in Adelaide case. So I'll pose this question to Adelaide. Yeah, I saw that just now your energy is 30%, and transport, including aviation, is another. I can't remember the figure, but definitely the two main sources. I think same everywhere in the world, I would say. So the question is, what are the approaches and continuous improvement plan to meet the set target? Well, I know you have already partly answered, but do you want to elaborate a bit more, William or Mingin, please?
So the state target is separate to the city, and so we try and align to the state government and federal government targets. In terms of how we contribute, we subsidize businesses and residents to take on sustainable technologies. It's another program that we run. And I guess what makes our case somewhat unique and special is we have percentage of city taxes that goes to climate change initiatives. and that's a long-term commitment. And so that enables us to subsidize the implementation of sustainability technology over time. So that's what we're doing.
Right. I do have a follow-up question on this issue. How is your target set in the city related to maybe the national target, if you have one? I can't remember now whether Australia is back in the Paris Agreement or not, but assuming you are, how do you actually link to the national target? Is there a link at all?
I think it's 28% by 2030.
National.
Yeah.
Okay.
So at the moment, we're still committed to carbon neutrality by 2025. So that would be much more ambitious than the national target. Whether or not we meet that target, I imagine we'll be ahead of the national target.
Okay, so you actually set a more ambitious goal compared to the national target. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, I will move on with our session now. But if you do have any questions, all of you, please do put in the Q&A box. I'll try to pick it up after our panel discussion. All right. Okay, so I think we have the last agenda for today, almost the last. Now it's 4:10, so we have about approximately 20-25 minutes to finish off. So I think, yeah, let's move on to the panel discussion. And yeah, I would like to invite all the panelists to join me. And yeah, I do have prepared a few sort of topics or questions to discuss, and some of them probably already addressed, but let me just ask this question first. Yeah. In your opinion, is existing city level global reporting standards such as GPC, I think already introduced, appropriate for all cities? And maybe I'll ask Michael again. He's the author for the standard. Do you think this is the right one for everyone?
Yeah, and I think similar to the question you already asked, I do. And again, the GPC isn't standard. It sets out requirements. It doesn't specify a methodology. And that means there's flexibility in the system. There's flexible boundaries. You can choose between a basic level and a basic plus level. Basic plus level is more complicated, includes more emission sources, more greenhouse gases. So there's flexibility built into the system to recognize that sort of smaller cities or towns can access it, whilst also larger cities and capitals can use it as well. So in my opinion, it is, because it is flexible. And I think the key thing, I think, in inventory is the data. And the GPC defines a very clear boundary. It gives guidance on how to collect data. But the main challenge in producing inventory is getting the right quality data at the right resolution at the level of your city. And what the GPC really does is it encourages these to be transparent, to be accountable, to provide an explanation on their methodology, the calculations they've done. So in terms of transparency, it's a really good approach, because it forces cities to assess data quality, to document their transparency, to use notation keys. So it gives clarity, it gives consistency, and as I mentioned, it is flexible to be used by the smallest hamlet or group of villages to the largest cities in the world. So yes, I do think it is appropriate for all cities.
Right, great. And probably also to Hannah, then you have seen so many cities reporting their emissions. Do you think that GPC is like the most commonly used standards, or is there other standards that have been used when they report to CDP?
Yeah, just from kind of a bigger picture, we definitely see that GPC is the standard of choice. So more than 50% of cities, for example, in 2020 said that they use GPC. That's around 350 cities or so globally. And it also includes small cities, such as a city called Panaji, which is in India, which has around a population of 115,000. Also a city called Valdivia in Chile, also less than 200,000. So, you know, we can see that across different geographies, across different sizes of cities, GPC is the standard of choice. But there are, certain scenarios where, for example, in some cases, there are national government standards or methodologies that are prescribed. So, cities might opt to use that approach. And in some cases, actually, cities have developed multiple inventories using different standards as well. So we do see that too. So yeah, I think GPC is definitely the most popular.
Okay, right. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay. So I would like to ask William and Mingin, especially on this one, because you have done it. From someone who is also involved in doing city inventory, we do know that data availability and the quality is usually a key barrier to doing a good reporting. Perhaps you can share with the audience here, because many of them are actually trying to start doing their city level reporting. Maybe you can share a little bit. How did you sort of overcome or address this issue, please?
I'll share a quick example, which in our latest emissions inventory. So it's the commercial and industrial waste. Like, we do not have any data, and all the data, like, it's supposed to be a reliable and long-term data so that you can report every year. So to calculate that, we finally decide to use the floor space of the commercial space in the city, and also the default generation rate of waste for each property type. It's not the most accurate data, but it is definitely the best data that is available out there. So my suggestion is to make sure you clarify everything in your reporting, to make sure your transparency, and also update when you have better data coming in. So yeah.
Also, just on the accuracy piece, we have long-term relationships with certain agencies like the transport agency. So they work with us and they put a lot of work into providing high quality data on bus and trains and things like that. And then Australia has really high standard of census data for things like transport. So the accuracy is pretty high for those larger emission sources. And then energy is primary data straight from the network companies. So there's no interpretation for the majority of the emissions.
Right. So I think I got 2 points there. One is what William says is engaging the data suppliers and establish relationship. Totally agree that we need that. And from Mingin is more making your assumptions or your alternate way of coming out with the data transparent and accountable. Yeah, so I think that's the experience from Adelaide. Fantastic. Yeah, let's move on. Next one, please. Okay, now let's go on to the benchmarking issue. I think one of the topic of today, because I have been asked this question a lot also. How do we benchmark ourselves? So I think the different speakers have sort of touched on the issue already, but now I want to bring it up for a discussion again. What would be a suitable benchmark to compare? What intensity denominator? I think earlier we have heard, like Adelaide mentioned, about greenhouse gas per capita, which is one of the most popular and commonly used denominator, the population. Is there, of course, we also saw that there's a use of using the energy consumption as another denominator. So maybe we can start with Micah. What's your experience so far, and how are we doing in this area?
Great, thank you. And this is a really good question. For me, first of all, the most important goal for benchmarking would be to benchmark yourself. Initially, forget about other cities, other regions, benchmark yourself, create a baseline, and use that to compare your own progress year on year. So the main benefit of benchmarking is to track your own progress. Your city is unique. It won't be exactly the same as any other city. Therefore, benchmarking yourself is going to be the most important. Look at overall emissions year by year, but also look at changes in different sectors to see is anything happening in these sectors that we weren't aware of, or indeed to confirm your projects are indeed having the desired impact. I think next, compare yourself to other similar cities in your own country. with a similar geography, so same size, same sort of industry makeup. So don't compare yourself to London or Paris or New York or KL per se, but compare yourself against cities that are very similar in structure and size as yours. And again, look at overall emissions, but also emissions by sector. And the great thing about the GPC is it doesn't just report emissions. If you're using Cirrus, the tool, you're also reporting your activity data, and you can compare emission factors, activity data, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. So do try and use as much data as you can to do that benchmarking. I'm not a fan of GDP as an indicator. I think GDP itself is a flawed indicator, and you can have very high GDP activities which create low emissions, but also you can have high GDP activities that do create emissions. So it's not always a very useful indicator. Overall, wealth is a big driver of emissions, but that's globally. And I think if you look benchmarking yourselves regionally, to me, it's less valuable. Per capita is very useful because ultimately it is about equity, but that does tend to hide differences in cities. And some cities will have a big industrial base, other cities won't. So do take that into account. But ultimately, we need to reduce emissions very aggressively. And the Paris goals mean that everyone's got to reduce emissions as quickly as they can. So benchmarking yourself against GDP may not, or other indicators may not be the most useful because they've got to come down. And don't give yourself the excuse to think, well, actually, they're going down relative to another indicator. But if the indicator is going up, then overall emissions are going up as well. So I think for me, the key thing is compare yourself against yourself, against other regions. Look at percentage reduction. That's a very useful benchmark as well, because we're now into the decade where we need to reduce emissions aggressively across all geographies, and we can't continue growing the economy while we increase emissions. We need to reduce those emissions. So do think very carefully around using sort of intensity indicators. Population, I think, would be the most useful one, and it is generally an accepted one globally.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for that. So I think just to sort of conclude what I at least from my perspective, what Michael is sharing is most important. You should benchmark with yourself because that's what you are going to be doing. Yeah, where are you going to head towards in the future? So of course, the first benchmark is yourself. Totally agree. And we saw that Adelaide has set their baseline in 2007 as basically the point of benchmarking. So I think that's a very good point. And secondly, it's important to compare to someone that's similar to you. I think that's a simple way to say it, right? That you don't want to compare to a city that is totally different composition, different types of industrial activities. You want to find a city that is comparable in probably population size, development status, and things like that. I guess, can you, Elvina, are you on the slides? Can you please open up the rest of the question, please? Yeah, so try to compare, consider these factors here, and try to compare with someone that you think is most appropriate. I think that's the way to do it. Next question, please. I don't know, Hannah, do you have any thoughts about how to do a reasonable comparison when it comes to benchmarking?
I don't think I have too much more to add, particularly to what Michael said. I think an interesting maybe point to look at is not necessarily looking at kind of the city-wide comparison, but looking at the sector-specific comparisons, because we know that majority of cities have their largest source of emissions coming from buildings, for example, followed by transportation and waste. So you can kind of dig down into that specific area and look at where other cities are seeing their emission sources, and do more kind of benchmarking and comparison on that level if the kind of wider or if other sectors don't completely match up and aren't like for like. So I think something that might be a useful tool is that from CDP we have the open data portal, where actually any publicly reported data is, freely accessible, and that can be downloaded, and you can basically filter, according to these different sectors in terms of where emissions are coming from and so on. And so following that, cities can actually also see what type of actions are being taken. And I saw that there is, questions related to energy or electricity and transportation. So there's a whole range of different actions that cities are taking based on seeing where their emissions are actually coming from. And so those things, you can potentially compare, whether it's, energy efficiency and retrofitting in buildings, looking at more kind of better fuel economy for your private transportation. So I think it's interesting to kind of think about it from the sector-based comparisons as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, to also have sectoral-based intensity to compare among cities as well. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, I think the last one here is probably most appropriate to be addressed by Adelaide. Yeah, in your past experience, how did you benchmark? I know, again, you have kind of, especially William has kind of already addressed this, but maybe I just want to ask you a little bit more, because you did mention your unique situation where you have a lot of visitors and people moving in the city and not really residing. And what's your experience in benchmarking with other cities in Australia? I mean, probably there are a lot of similar cities in Australia.
Yeah, I think similar to what Michael was saying, you're benchmarking against yourself. So that's when Ming was asking me about that question, I say we benchmark against ourselves, because that's the emission reductions is what it's all about. In terms of benchmarking generally, I'm stepping back to the question we kind of skipped, and that's about resourcing this work. Local governments, we have to do everything. So we can only spend so much time reporting and collecting data. We also have to balance it with taking action. So I think the resourcing, like if you're a smaller city just getting started, you can start by downscaling national data, maybe on population or whatever denominator you choose. But just getting a starting point for the data doesn't have to be perfect. You can continually improve it. Just in the last year, we were downscaling refrigerants from national scale data, and we had time to think about a new way to do that. So we created a new calculation from actual data. So, but that was 13 years later after we started. So I would just say resourcing, just get started and improve as you have the resources and benchmark against yourself. But share experiences with others, because if you've done the hard thinking, there'll be 10 other cities who are just on that step.
All right, thanks for that. Okay, so we are almost reaching 4:30 now in Malaysian time, and we do have one more question coming in. And oh, Mr. Boyd has joined us. Okay, before I go to Boyd, let me pull out a question here from Wan Zaliza from PLAN Malaysia. PLAN Malaysia is the Town and Country Planning Department of Malaysia. So she has a very general question, I would say, that how do we start to do inventory for a city? And I guess we turn to Michael again. He's the guru or the master of starting this. Michael, would you like to give a general approach how to start? It is a big question.
How to start? I mean, the key thing is just to get started. That's the most important thing. And I always say, don't let perfect data hold you back. Just get started. It's a journey. You're going to produce your best inventory first time round, but just get started. Use national data, like just suggested. Scale national data to your city based on population or GDP. Use a proxy city. If you're in Malaysia, use KL, for example. They have a really good GPC inventory. And initially, just scale their data to your city boundary. It won't be 100% accurate. It doesn't matter. It is to get started. Just get started. Document your methodology, your calculations, your assumptions to make sure it's transparent and people can feed back to you. and then over time seek to improve the accuracy of your inventory. Initially, your first step will probably be 80% right. You're going to get in the right ballpark simply by scaling. That will allow you to identify your main sectors, then prioritize those for collecting more data. But just get started. Find a similar inventory for a city similar to you in your region, same size, scale that data, contact your national ministries for data, your local authority colleagues, but don't worry about perfect, because that's often the enemy of good. Just get started, have good data, and over time, seek to improve those areas where you're less certain about. But I always say, get started and focus on improvements over time, over 2 or 3 years, to really build up your knowledge, your experience, your expertise, your network, but at least get something out there to communicate to your colleagues, to your citizens, your businesses, that you're taking this seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. As a practitioner in city level reporting as well myself, yeah, don't afraid to get started. And of course, if it is very technical when it comes to this accounting. I think you have heard from Michael on the coverage, and you can always also reach out to experts out there, people like Michael, for example, to sort of get a better understanding on what the standard is about. How do you actually calculate? What kind of methodologies we need to refer to? And yeah, I think just to get started would be also my answer, but there are helps that you can get from experts out there as well. Yeah, and you have a few experts here in the panel already, so you can always reach out to us. Yeah. For your information, we are also going to share the slides presented today with you in our website later on. So do not worry if you didn't catch all the things on the slide earlier on. Okay, we have more questions coming, so I think we should take them. From Ms. Siti Katina from a local government in Malaysia, from Subang Jaya, I believe, MBSJ. And her question is, what are the challenges in benchmarking a GHG inventory for cities? I think we have sort of covered them in a way. So I don't know whether we, maybe yeah, Michael, maybe you can say a bit more on this part.
Yeah, the key thing is, make sure you've got your own inventory. The second thing is to collect data elsewhere to allow you to do those comparisons. And CDP have an amazing data set you can use. It's all around the world. C40 does for their membership. ICLEI does as well. Within Malaysia, there's a lot of data as well that you can use. So source data from other cities. And that will both allow you to compare, to help you improve your own inventory by looking at what they did, where they got the data from, what calculations they did. But it gives you data to do those comparisons and to do the benchmarking. Looking at overall emissions, but also looking at different sectors, different subsectors. So definitely go through the CDP data portal. There's a C40 GPC dashboard explorer. Get comparative information that allows you then to begin that benchmarking exercise. But there's a lot of data out there. I think one challenge is to collect that data. But CDP C40 has made that easier for you. So definitely use their data portals to access that data.
Fantastic. That's very useful. Okay, I think I just want to ask a last question since I have seen Alex and Boyd is online, because I do know that Iskandar Malaysia, through Iskandar Regional Development Authority, have done this regional level reporting from Malaysia, and they also report to CDP, as I know. So maybe they could share with us their experience from Malaysia, at least. Alex, are you still online? Or if not, Boyd, you have just joined us, right?
Hi, Mr. Sood.
Hey, Alex, how are you?
I am good. Hi, Hannah.
Yeah, so maybe you want to say a few words about your experience and how have you? Yeah, please.
We have been a member of GCOM since 2017, and as part of the commitment, we have been reporting to CDP since 2015. Yep, That's been really helpful because reporting through CDP, we can benchmark ourselves as well as with other cities. Yeah. Mr. Boyd, would you want to share something?
Okay. Thank you, Soon, and the panel, and of course to Hannah, who is kind of good connections there. Thank you. I think it's exactly, I missed most of the debate obviously because I'm meeting earlier, but whatever Michael said just now is very, very pertinent to how things are done in terms of inventories. Get started is exactly the point, because when Iskandar Malaysia started this, we were the first ones to prepare inventory in Malaysia. So it's kind of a very good pride moment for us to do that. And of course, the involvement of EcoIdeal in the inventory also very good. We've done 3 inventories now, and able to know and understand how we did it ourselves. We didn't go and benchmark with all those big countries because we wanted to see how we are doing it ourselves. And a lot of the data initially were aggregated data, but we do have some good data that we've collected, obviously, relating to the fact that Iskandar Malaysia is an economic region. So from that basis, we have quite a lot of data. And I do agree, GDP is not a benchmark way of doing things. It's better to have other ways of doing this because that's the more important thing. The other one I want to add is, now that we know that each country has their own NDC targets, we need to align with the national context and the national target for this kind of thing, so that we can then easily compare within your own country or what you want to do. And for us, being the first one in Malaysia, it's a great opportunity to be able to understand, to learn from our experience. There's quite a lot of those because they're really literally learning of how we did it, what we wanted to do, and the resources that we have. Resources in terms of funding and the data itself. In Malaysia, as you know, not that easy to get data, but once we got it going, and as the years go by, we got better. The new things are coming in, and we understand it a lot more. The other one that I would like to share is the fact that initially we started with WRI, World Resources Institute, on their GPC as the benchmark or the approach that we did, because we were one of the first regions globally. When WRI started GPC, we were one of the pilot countries or pilot cities involved. So it's another good thing to learn from and to understand. But this idea of GPC is very important because it's pretty accurate in terms of what we needed and what we needed to do. Inventory-wise, I think if possible, all countries should be doing that, or all cities at least should be doing that, because that's an important way of benchmarking yourselves in relation to your country and possibly with kind of similar cities globally. So for us, very good way of understanding it. We are happy to share what we have learned in the past with the other cities, which in fact we have shared through Malaysian Urban Forum, Global Covenant of Mayors as well. And then these are the things that are really critical when we come to this kind of discussion. The other one, of course, important is what Hannah is doing under the CDP's global platform online. And we are very happy to be awarded leadership on that one as one of the top level in Asia, actually, together with Quezon City. So it's another platform I think you guys, for those who are preparing this in Malaysia, could also look at later on. We have done it, and then we know what we can do. And by the time you get to this point, you will know what you need and what you want to focus on in terms of what are the areas that are really clearly important for you to handle. So just kind of sharing our ideas. We're happy. Alex can, of course, talk about that and then share his email to everyone if you want to know more about what we have done in Iskandar Malaysia. Nevertheless, it's actually all online. If you look on, type our names or Iskandar Malaysia name, you can find all the information online.
One more advertisement before we go is this national conference. It's called the Malaysia Low Carbon City Conference, happening in July next month, on the 13th. And this will be a very big event, as far as I know. And unfortunately, it's virtual. But what to do then? So this one is also coming up, and yeah, please put it on your calendar to join this event as well. Yeah, so next one, please. Yeah, so I think we've come to the end of this webinar. I hope most of you found it useful. And I know the time of 90 minutes is not very long, but do come back to us if you have any further questions for the speakers or myself. And yeah, I wish you a very good day and stay safe, everyone. Yeah, we will. I'm pretty sure we will be able to conquer this pandemic at the end. So everyone, thank you so much again. Once again, stay home. Don't go everywhere. Take your vaccine soon. Bye bye.